Welcome back. This critique looks at your analysis of that tragic Jaipur highway horror, specifically the Harmada crash, the dumper driver admitting he'd been drinking. You've laid out the facts very clearly, the driver admitting to drinking twice, the RTO canceling the license. That's all crystal.
Yeah, that factual base is solid. You need that clarity up front. It really establishes the severity of what happened with the driver. But if the goal here is for this analysis to actually push for real policy changes, we've got to look wider than just the driver.
Okay, so right now the focus is really on the driver's actions, his accountability, which feels right initially.
It does feel right. But to really maximize the impact, the relevance of this piece, the narrative needs a bit of a pivot. It should shift the main focus away from just the individual driver's negligence and more towards the, let's call them systemic vulnerabilities, right? The things that allowed this kind of tragedy to even happen.
Ah, I see.
The weakness right now, I think, is that by centering so much on the driver's admission and the license cancellation, the report kind of risks framing it as just a one-off incident. A single case of moral failure that's now solved because the license is gone.
Right, like bad driver caught, problem fixed, end of story.
Exactly. And that really limits the so what factor for the people who make policy. They already know about the crash. What they need is insight into prevention. So our suggestion is, use those shocking facts, a commercial driver admitting drinking twice before a fatal crash, use that as the hook, the undeniable starting point, to then launch into a bigger discussion about the failures in, say, RTO monitoring or fleet oversight, maybe the whole safety culture in commercial transport.
Okay, I get that. But sometimes, if you shift focus too much away from the driver's personal responsibility, doesn't that dilute the accountability people expect to see? How do you balance that human element with the systemic critique?
Symptom, not the disease. Okay.
So, for example, to give that systemic failure some real context, instead of just stating the RTO canceled the license, maybe try comparing how often licenses are canceled in Jaipur for drunk driving over the last year. Compare that against, say, the total number of highway patrol stops that specifically targeted commercial vehicles during that same time. Ah, that's clever. It immediately puts the RTO's reaction to the cancellation into perspective against their proactive efforts, like patrols. But is that data actually, available? Could the writer realistically get those numbers?
That's always the challenge, isn't it? Access to data. If specific numbers on patrol stops are hard to pin down, okay, we pivot. Maybe introduce a section that tries to quantify the risk in a more general way. Ask the question, if this driver was impaired and still out there driving, how many other dumper drivers on that same highway might be operating under similar risky conditions?
Okay.
Maybe because enforcement is lax, or they're under pressure, facing extreme fatigue, things like that.
Right. That definitely shifts the focus. It moves from just talking about one bad driver to analyzing the risk exposure for everyone using that road. That's much more compelling for regulators, isn't it?
Absolutely. It elevates it from a single tragic event to a potential ongoing public safety threat. And that actually leads us nicely into the second major area for improvement, really digging into the causal chain. We know the immediate cause, the alcohol impairment. He admitted it.
Yeah. The what is clear, the driver drank, but maybe not the why or the context around it.
Exactly. We see the action, but maybe not the full picture behind it, the pressures or maybe the lack of oversight that contributed. So, while that immediate cause is clear, to really strengthen this report, it needs a deeper dive, a more challenging one probably, into the factors that might pressure commercial drivers into these kinds of high-risk behaviors. The material right now, perhaps because it's sticking close to initial media reports, it kind of stops the investigation too soon. It settles for the driver's action without really digging into the organizational context, the economic pressures of the dumper's operation.
And that leaves a big hole for the reader, right? We know what happened, but not necessarily why that behavior might have been, tolerated, or maybe even inadvertently encouraged by the whole commercial setup.
That's precisely the gap we need to fill for prevention. We need to understand the environment that might normalize this kind of risk-taking. So the suggestion here is to really broaden the investigation, look into potential fleet management issues, compliance with hours of service rules, and also the underlying economics. Are there incentives or maybe disincentives that push drivers towards things like drinking, or maybe just driving when dangerously tired?
Okay, but how does the writer practically get inside the operations of a private dumper fleet? That kind of information's usually kept pretty close to the chest, isn't it?
It is. It's notoriously difficult. So it's less about the writer becoming an insider investigator overnight and more about framing the right analytical questions that policymakers can then put to the industry.
Okay, like what?
Well, you could investigate the dumper's specific use case by researching typical logistics in that sector. Was the driver, for instance, routinely working super long shifts, 16, 18 hours, maybe to meet tight deadlines linked to profit margins?
Hmm.
Suggest looking into the known links between excessive, unsupervised hours and drivers maybe feeling the need to self-medicate or just stay awake, and tie that directly back to the company's scheduling practices, maybe even their business model.
Ah, that makes it actionable for the industry side. It puts the spotlight on how their own operations, their push for profit, might actually create dangerous incentives. Less about the driver's choices in a vacuum, more about the employer's standard procedures.
Exactly. And we can actually reinforce that shift using technology. Think about the vehicle itself. Pose questions like, was the specific dumper or the fleet it belongs to properly monitored? Did it have GPS, telematics? If not, why not? Because telematics can track things like speeding, harsh braking, even how long a truck is idling, data that could flag erratic behavior or excessive hours to a supervisor almost instantly.
So you're not just mentioning the tech, but actually suggesting making it mandatory as a concrete way to prevent this kind of unsupervised, potentially impaired driving?
Potentially, yes, or at least asking why it's not standard. But you're right, just having the box isn't enough. Someone needs to be watching the data.
Right, it needs auditing, doesn't it? Otherwise, the fleet manager could just ignore the alerts.
Precisely. So, if we suggest or question the lack of telematics, the logical next step is suggesting mandatory, maybe random, third-party audits of that data. That puts the responsibility for ongoing driver supervision squarely on the carrier, where it really belongs. Instead of just relying on occasional police checks on the highway, it's about verifying safety, not just hoping for it.
Okay, that's a much deeper level of analysis. That's excellent. Now, thinking about the end game, the recommendations, I did notice they felt a bit general right now.
Yes, that's the third key area. It's a structural thing we need to address. You can have a powerful analysis, a strong case for action, but if the recommendations are too broad, like just calling for better safety or more oversight, they tend to fall flat.
They lack specific ownership, maybe.
Exactly. So the third point is, make sure the recommendations aren't just vague calls for improvement, but are actually broken down, segmented, and targeted very precisely at the specific actors you've identified in the analysis, the RTO, the fleets, etc.
Because the weakness as it stands is that if the recommendations are just one big block, they might just get lost. Like, if everything's aimed at the Ministry of Transport, the person in charge of, say, RTO enforcement or road design might not see their specific task clearly laid out.
Absolutely. They need to see their name on it, figuratively speaking. So the suggestion is to fundamentally restructure that section. Break down the actionable suggestions into, say, 3 or 4 distinct categories. Make sure each category aligns really clearly with the specific systemic failures you've already discussed. That makes it much easier for policymakers, regulators, industry folks to see their part and actually adopt the suggestions.
Right. It's about making it digestible and assignable within the bureaucracy. Okay, so how would we break this down? What would those segments look like?
Okay, first, let's have a clear regulatory RTO focus. We need to go beyond just noting the license cancellation. Propose specific, verifiable steps for what happens after cancellation like this, especially regarding getting a license back. For example, mandatory addiction counseling, monitored rehab programs, maybe structured by the RTO, but potentially delivered by vetted specialists. And make that completion a prerequisite before any commercial relicensing is even considered.
That's crucial. It changes the RTO's role from just punishment to actual risk management through mandated rehab. It sets a really high, clear bar for returning to commercial driving.
Second, you target the industry itself, the fleets, where the money and direct oversight are. Call this the industry fleet focus. Here you could recommend things like mandatory third-party audits. Audits specifically looking at driver welfare, their training records, how fatigue is managed. And crucially, you tie compliance with these audits directly to their annual operating permits. No demonstrated compliance on driver welfare? Then maybe they lose the right to operate those commercial vehicles on public highways. Simple as that.
That definitely puts teeth into it. Direct economic consequences for sloppy management, that's often the fastest way to get industry attention.
And finally, you can't forget the place itself. The road. We need an infrastructure design focus. If this Harmada crash location is known to be tricky or dangerous, suggest specific, ideally low-cost engineering fixes. Things that could mitigate risks, especially for drivers who might be impaired or distracted when they approach that spot.
Okay, but practical examples here are key, right? We can't suggest rebuilding the whole junction if we're talking quick interventions.
Exactly. Low cost, high impact. Think about things like really pronounced rumble strips placed well before critical points in that area. Enhanced, maybe larger, more reflective signage. Or even just specific, optimized lighting for that stretch of highway. Things that might give an impaired or fatigued driver that extra fraction of a second reaction time. It provides immediate, tangible fixes, beyond just trying to change driver behavior alone.
That feels like a really comprehensive set of solutions. You've got the regulator, the industry, and the physical environment covered. This has been incredibly helpful. So, just to recap for the listener, we focused on 3 main areas to really lift this analysis from just a report towards something that could drive policy.
That's right. First, broadening the scope. Moving beyond blaming just the individual driver to look at the whole systemic failure, the environment that allowed it. Second, digging deeper into the why. Exploring those critical commercial pressures and fleet management issues, basically. The economics driving behavior on the road.
And third, making the recommendations sharp and targeted, segmenting them so specific players, RTO, fleet owners, road designers, know exactly what their role is in fixing this.
And I want to reiterate, the factual groundwork you've laid down is really strong. It powerfully shows how serious this incident was. These suggestions are purely aimed at taking that strong base and building on it, turning the analysis into something highly impactful, something ready for policymakers, that looks at the entire transport ecosystem, not just one piece of it.
We definitely encourage you to work through these suggestions, integrate them, and please, send the revised material back to us. We'd be happy to take another look.